As the sun sets over the horizon of a civilization that's long neglected its primeval origins and its supernatural dignity, the dual figures of both Friedrich Nietzsche and Julius Evola stand out like silhouetted minarets, like church spires over its ruins. Upon that skyline, the two are emblazoned as if against the blood-red sky. They cast distinctive shadows upon the cobbled streets, the marketplaces below. Nietzsche stands tall, a Renaissance-styled cathedral, a recalling of the loftiest and most passionate of vocations embodied by our forebears. Though today largely disowned and thrown into disarray through generations, perhaps centuries of slow, corrosive, and systematic neglect. Yet Evola is a Gothic staple, simple, primordial, distant in his deceptively rudimentary architecture, and yet for that very reason all the more enigmatic and mysterious. What the Renaissance knew and lived is the heights of a radical and ecstatic religious devotion. The Middle Ages had often calmly intuited, instead as a supra-rational and hypercosmic order. The proto-Nietzschean, Faustian, Baroque, lively and dramatic arches and buttresses of the late Renaissance Roman cathedrals signify, it must be admitted, a certain abandon from the perspective of Evolian tradition. Like the cathedrals of today hosting all the humanitarian abominations of a world entirely divorced from its spiritual principles, the Nietzschean ethos usurps the vertical orientation and the ascetic psychology of the older architectures, magnifying them, exaggerating them, retaining their most purely outward, most external values, and in their place offers a robust, decadent, and lively expression of the power of the differentiated psychology of the unique individual today. His virtue in this is not without its value, as so little's left which might be affirmed today with honesty, with integrity. Open and rebellious hostility remains the last stronghold of psychological liberty. Such was and forever will be the value of Nietzsche, that didactic Chiron. Training the future warriors will clean up swamp and get the trains running on time again. But the small, simple, Evolian Gothic church conceals its own hidden power, and such power should not be underestimated. What it lacks in outward display and lofty exaltation it stores within as dark, unspoken force. The spires of the medieval church, while not so towering as the later Renaissance cathedral, communicate their heights precisely through their intrinsic and shadowy depth. Nor should it be forgotten that such hidden noetic beauty was more than capable of killing an entire historic pagan civilization when it needed to, and killing it with the uncompromising rapidity, the volatile dexterity of a swift-footed Achilles. If for Nietzsche his cathedral spires, his alpine mountains, his heights, in other words, could be said to represent an aristocratic sentimentality, free from all superstitious, all moralistic dross, for Evola, himself a native mountaineer, the mountaintops represented rather the height of spiritual exaltation, divorced of all sentimentality whatsoever, aristocratic or otherwise, because architecture, for Evola, was not to serve as a kaleidoscopic interplay, a dramatic interweaving of neon colors, of vivid highlights and beautiful shadows. Rather, the Gothic church, as an embodiment of sacred institution, should draw one towards the super-sensible, towards what's other and higher than mere artistic sentiment, to be ultimately brought beyond the entirety of the human psychology altogether. And whereas for Nietzsche the pristine Baroque corridor of the cathedral decked in gallant color plays, and epic pieces of drama, even tragic drama, might represent the exquisitely refined artistic expression of an Olympian superhuman intellect, the astute reader might suspect he had contact with such. For Evola it was precisely the dirt, and the dark, the mossy exteriors, the cold, murky Gothic corridors which gave the spiritual institution its best outward display for its true and paradoxical inner light, its contradictory inner raison d'etre, because for Evola, and contra Nietzsche, even the Übermensch was tarnished by the spiritually obfuscating grime of humanism, of sentimentality, of individualism. The greatest lights are never seen, the primordial center is not to be appreciated on any mere artistic basis, nor can the world ever hope to be redeemed as some aesthetic phenomenon per Nietzsche. Evola could only laugh at all this paltry, prideful, arrogant nonsense, even if part of him perhaps secretly laughed with it. Nietzsche himself was not unacquainted with such derisory and cruel laughter. For him, only the philosopher can truly laugh after all, whereas Evola is unfortunately bound to the act of destruction, to the iconoclastic leveling of every false and modern idol, even the most sacred, all for the sake of spiritual elevation, for asceticism, and ultimately for metaphysical truth. For Nietzsche, these concerns were never a motivating factor. For Nietzsche, if someone should suddenly find themselves transfigured and made into a god, and that in the truest and ontological sense, then that could only speak all the more to the ridiculousness of gods than to the spiritual dignity of man. And make no mistake, man was already ridiculous. It was precisely the recognition of this ridiculousness which made all of life worth affirming, and which was, in the final analysis, the philosopher's paradoxical greatest and ultimate triumph. The philosopher, unlike his jaded contemporaries, was in his highest and most profound moments a victor over life. He was capable of breathing, and of breathing fully. All of this, for Evola, was simply a starting-off point, a preliminary impetus arising from this fact, the fact of the world's inherent ridiculousness. The end goal, once received from these Nietzschean lesser mysteries, was therefore the conquest of the greater, of what's beyond the human, of what's in fact superhuman, in the etymological sense. The creation of a post-human Übermensch was therefore to be transmuted and refined into the mastery over life itself, over death itself, over all the luminous forces controlling and usurping the lives of both gods and men, over the spiritual sun, drenching this evening skyline in a narcotic and feverish days, and in luminous sanguinary twilight. And thus were led to two radically different conceptions of freedom: the freedom of man above the ruins of his contemporaries, and the freedom of man above himself. It cannot be denied that above all else, both men remained perennially oriented towards such ideals of freedom. Yet the two notions of freedom are not irreconcilable, nor are they incompatible. Rather, they both represent successive levels, successive stages on the path towards deliverance.